Okay. Oh, perfect. Morning. 8 o'clock. We'll wait a few minutes before we get started. Brent Mathison is filming us today. We're more than 6 feet apart right now. And when I'm not on camera, I'll do that to protect Brent. But when I'm on camera, I will drop my shield because in case someone's hard of hearing and maybe they lip read, I want them to be able to see what I'm saying. So I'll be going back and forth that way. So we're going to be safe, but we want to keep doing this. We've really enjoyed it. We hope you are too. We're going to wait a couple minutes before we get going. It's early. Maybe some people are going to log on at 8:02, 8:03, and that's okay. We chose Thursday morning, and if mornings are good, let us know, because we can do this again. But I chose morning. I want to do the morning time because the birds are usually a little more active, and the forecast earlier this week talked about sun, and we will get sun today, but as you see, we are not getting sun right now. We're getting snow, and so you can still hear the birds. They're here. But I was expecting a little bit more, and I think it'll come when it gets warm, a little bit warmer. So we could do this again on a slightly warmer day, maybe in June. Who knows when we'll get our next day. I don't know my birds as well, but if you hear birds, you can put it in the comment section so we can learn some of the calls. That'd be really great. I do hear red-winged blackbirds. And Brent's panning around, and he just panned by a small hickory. That's a cherry or a birch. So another way you can learn trees is, oh, that's a cherry. Smells like bitter, burnt almonds. It's got arsenic compounds in it. So don't eat your cherry pits. Don't eat your cherry seeds. Yeah. And so I just scratched it, and it smelled like burnt almond, bitter burnt almond. That was a really strong one. Maybe it's because spring is starting. That's stronger than what I'm used to. Birch, which we'll see up this trail, will smell more like wintergreen or peppermint. And so taste and smell are other ways to identify tree species before there are leaves. There's lenticels on this bark. Little dots, those dots that you can see. And that's a good way to identify cherries. Though we're going to see a birch that's going to have those as well. And just over to your right, Brent, the small tree with the big buds that are opening up, that's a hickory. I haven't looked closely to know which one it is, but what we've seen so far here are pignut and mockernut. Oh, I need to set my clock. I'm rambling now. Anyway, so that's a hickory. The hickory's a southern species for this part of New England. They're about to unfurl their leaves, so it really is springtime. I'm going to set my timer for 30 minutes, so we'll get started now. Okay. I'm Neil Pederson. I'm a forest ecologist at the Harvard Forest. Today I'm representing the Maynard Tree Corps, which is a new group whose goal is basically to grow and preserve the forest canopy here in Maynard, whether that's in people's trails or along the streets or in parks or along the school. We are going to try to do a tree planting ceremony somehow, socially responsible, keeping distance from everyone, for Arbor Day or sometime around then this spring, or maybe for Maynard's 150th celebration. We have a web page, we'll link below. We've just formed a list of tree species for Maynard that we would suggest that you can plant in your yard. And we're thinking about maybe trying to get people to plant a tree in their yard this spring as something life-affirming, positive that we can do here in Maynard during these very hard times. I hope everyone's doing well. My background is in forest ecology. I've done a lot of research in the eastern United States, but I've never been really in one place more than 4 or 5 years to really get to know a place. And so this is a trail near my house, near our house, and I'm really getting to know this, and I wanted to share this with you because there's a lot of species and there's a lot of interesting history on this trail. So we'll get started now. We've already seen 20 species. We've only traveled about half a mile on this trail. We've already seen 20 species. I'm sure I've missed a few because we're not going super slow. But we're not going to see many for the rest of the trail, but there's a few more for us to see. So this is a very diverse trail to talk about. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the history and the landscape and the ecology of this place. And when Brent's panning to this very large black oak tree, at about 15 feet above the ground, you'll see it splits into 2 branches. We would call this a wolf tree, though I don't think it's classically a wolf tree, but it is a type of wolf tree. And what this means is that it's a tree that is from a time before the forest was here. And so if trees don't have to grow tall, they won't. And this is why trees in your yard grow up a little bit and then they grow out. They're nice spreading canopies. But the trees in this forest, most of them are growing up. They're competing with each other to get to sunlight. But it's tall to grow. It's hard to grow tall for a tree because you got to get water from your roots all the way to the top of the tree so you can put out your leaves and do photosynthesis and all that stuff. So when you see trees like this in a forest, like this open-grown black oak, you know that there wasn't forest here. You don't know when there wasn't forest here, but you know that there wasn't a forest here. So this was a much more open landscape, probably grazed for pasture or something like that. But now the forest has recovered, and we're going to see more signs of that. But I've really come to appreciate this forest in the last few months because there's more and more evidence that this was really different only about 50, 80, 100, 120 years ago. And if I really wanted to fool you, I could walk through here and I could tell you this is an old growth forest because there's some signs that it is becoming a very mature forest, almost an old growth forest. And that's about all we'll spend on this, but I would encourage you to Google wolf tree. There's an article by Michael Gage, G-A-I-G-E, where he talks about wolf trees like this, and they're being now recognized for being unique and special from another time period, but they're important for biodiversity. This structure that they have creates more habitat for wildlife. So I was a forester in a former life, and I would look at that tree and I'd say, well, that's not a good tree for timber because it's not straight timber, it's not good for lumber, but this is good for wildlife. So this is a really special tree right here. Let's get started on new trees. As Brent and I were setting up, talking this morning, I finally noticed this after about 5 minutes. I'm slow sometimes. This is spice bush. It's a small bush. I'm going to call it a tree because the difference between a tree and a bush is, we're splitting hairs sometimes, but I'm going to elevate this into a tree. It's flowering right now, so there's our first sign of spring on this. And what spice bush does essentially is, one of the things I like about it is it's a host for the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. And so you should go Google that. I'll put a link in it later today. It's a Lindera benzoin spice bush. And what it does, this caterpillar is a large, rather fat caterpillar whose tail looks like the face of a snake. So this is a way of tricking predators to saying, you don't want to eat me, I'm a big bad snake, instead of a yummy small caterpillar. And so they're really cool looking individuals. I've never seen one in person. I'm going to plant 2 in my yard this spring, so maybe we can get some. So we've seen a lot of species. We're going to do some review, but mostly now we're going to walk more than talk, and we'll stop at new species. So let's get going. Here's a nice American elm right here. It's become one of my favorites. I've never lived with American elm so much, but the bark is just really gorgeous. This one's a pale yellow, but when it rains it turns almost orange, brown. Over here, this was a nice surprise for me. What you see, those big leafy green plants, is skunk cabbage. They have these flower-like structures where they can melt the snow. If you know, when there used to be snow in the winter here, they can melt the snow, so they can grow up through the snow very, very early or late in the winter, however you want to call it, early spring, late winter. But just beyond that, you can see stands of irises. And this whole stretch of the river, surprising to me, is full of irises. I don't know what species, I don't know if they're native or not, but this whole stretch of the Essevet River is full of irises, and I'm really looking forward to when they start blooming. This is one of my favorite parts of the trail. It's a nice little hill. There's a good diversity of pine trees and oak trees. The structure is a little more complex. And this is the part of the trail where I see and hear more birds. The birds seem to like this part of the trail really nicely. And somewhere up above here, I could put a link online. They discovered, when they were putting in the water treatment plant that's up ahead that we'll sort of be able to see, they discovered that this was a place for Native Americans to come gather from 7,000 years ago. So this trail that we're walking, I don't know if you know, but a lot of our major highways are old animal trails, and Native American indigenous people use these same trails, and now we use these same trails. And it's said that Thoreau came to Maynard and sat up on Summer Hill one time to view or whatever. And I like to think that not only did maybe Thoreau walk this path, but people have been walking this path for thousands of years. You know, the river's a nice place to hang out. We all like rivers. That's a very human thing. You can come and fish, you can come and swim, you can come and paddle. You can just look at the lazy river. And you got to think that people have been doing this now for several thousand years. And there's a site up here where there is actually evidence of that. So, I'll stop talking. I forgot this patch was here. So this is the next species that I wanted to show you. This is called hophorn beam. And I'll let Brent get closer to that so you can see the bark. Astraea virginiana, and this is one of the few species that I call it by its scientific name, Astraea virginiana, because it has so many different common names. It's the hophorn beam, but it's also called ironwood, and we already saw musclewood, which is also called ironwood, and there's another name that I'm blanking out on this. But this is a tree that I've come to really appreciate so much more in the last few years. It has this very flaky bark, which is one of the best characteristics of this. These narrow strips of bark that are very flaky. that's one of the best characteristics for that species. It's a slightly dull tan color in its bark. And it doesn't get much bigger than that. It can get twice that size, but that's a pretty good size for this species. I would say we don't know so much about this. There are some parts in New England where you can see whole stands of this tree. They are the exception, not the rule. This is more common. There happens to be a cluster of about 5 or 6 of them here, but we don't really know as much about their ecology. And if you don't mind panning up, Brent, another good trait for this species is it has extremely fine twigs. It's just about to leaf out right now. And its leaves are a nice bright spring green in my memory, so I don't know if my memory's correct, but that's what I sort of remember. And they look sort of like a birch leaf. But this bark right here, get to learn this bark. This is the best way, one of the best ways to learn this species. So, species 22, Australia. Virginiana is the scientific name, but it's also hop hornbeam. And it gets its name hop hornbeam because when it does flower, they look like hops. And so that's where that name partially comes from. Here's a smaller one right here. There's 2 more uphill. And oh, there's a lot more uphill. I've not slowed down enough. There's a lot of them in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Yeah, there's a lot. Well, you know, you see more once you slow down. That's what Brent and I were talking about just a second ago. And here's a fairly large one right here, but as we get closer, you can look at it more. That one has smoother bark, and we've talked about this a lot. When trees are growing slower, their bark gets a little bit smoother. So that's a slower growing, slightly larger Australia or hop hornbeam. And if you don't mind panning just more to your left, Brent, that large tree right there, right in the center of your screen, that's a black oak. You could see the black blocky bark, but you saw the white patch of balding bark at the base. Most trees create this balding patch when they're growing very slow, and that's a good example of what it looks like on a black oak. Here's some more Australia here, here. Here, here. We'll stop here for a quick second. I really like this section because the trees here are much more dynamic. There's a lot more structure here. And one way I look for old trees is I try to find trees that are bent over, like they're struggling to reach the canopy. And that is the form of these trees. I wouldn't say they're old because of that. They're obviously leaning towards the river because they have less competition. So like the wolf tree that we talked about just a few minutes ago, these aren't wolf trees per se, but they don't have to grow up. They can grow out and gather more sunlight. But they're also being forced to grow out over the river because the trees like this mighty white oak, these trees are up higher, so they grow taller and they can spread out too, and they kind of force their neighbors lower down in the slope to grow out more that way. So this part of the forest is really kind of beautiful to me because it's really dynamic. You have these graceful arching oaks, beech, red maple. You have some large red oaks right here. And that large red oak, just below that, there's a white oak that's really skinny, smooth bark that's arching up over the river. Those two trees might be exactly the same age, even though the red oak is twice the size of the white oak. And it's just partly their growth rates and their canopy position. And here's our pignut hickory that we learned just last time. Very sharp ridges, you can really feel it. This is a very big one for this area. It's not huge, but this is a good site diameter. Very mature tree, very fast growing, very hardwood. Here's a review, but here's musclewood. When Brent gets close to it, you'll see why it's called musclewood. Looks like muscle. Also called blue beech, also called ironwood. And then there's like American hophorn beam or something like that. It's got too many names. Too many names. So here's a new species right here, and I'll back off on that one. Oh wait, before you get here. This is sassafras. And if I was a real forester, oh good. There you go. If I was a real forester, I'd have a knife, but I'm not a real forester. But this is sassafras, and I peeled back the bark. I don't recommend you doing that, but I did that for educational purposes, because this is one good characteristic of this species. Underneath the bark is this beautiful orange color. You could see it when the bark gets worn away. But the way that I identify this species now, and again, it's taken me a long time to just be able to spot this and see this and identify it quickly, is it's really curvy in many different ways. This trunk is very curvy, but as Brent pans up to the twigs, and it's going to be probably a little harder to see, but they have nice fat buds that are going to open up soon. But you can even see that there's a real curviness in the twigs. There aren't many tree species that I can think of in this part of the world that have such curvy, loopy twigs. The twigs are greenish in color. You could go see them by the Green Meadows Elementary School. There's a nice little stand of smaller ones there. The twigs can be greenish. You could break them off. You could chew on them. They're delicious. This is where root beer comes from, right? So they get the extract from the roots, and this is where root beer comes from. And so this has a particular scent. I can't, it's just a spicy scent that you'll recognize. It'll remind you of root beer. I used to chew these twigs in the field all the time. Don't chew too much. It's a little carcinogenic, but it's delicious. And when I lived in Kentucky, they would stock the extract in the grocery stores, and you could make a nice honey from it, or a nice tea from it. I was thinking about the honey. You put a little honey in it. You put some little sugar, some ice cubes with the extract, and you have a really wonderful summer drink. Sassafras tea, it's highly recommended. I highly recommend it. They say they take the carcinogenic properties out of it in the extract. I hope that's true, but whatever. But that's sassafras, really one of my favorite trees, and in the spring you'll be able to recognize it. It has the glove, the mitten, and the other shape. It has 3 different distinct shapes. One is sort of like this, one is like this, and then one is like that. And it's just a wonderful tree. We put it on our species list because everyone should have a sassafras in their yard. But there's a cluster of sassafras here. Brent, if you don't mind panning back, there's a big oak tree that has balding bark at the base. Mm-hmm. That's a red oak. And then if you pan just a little bit downslope from that, just directly downslope, there's a medium-sized tree that's really curvy. That's a larger, I want to call it sassafras. And I think that's what it is. Some of those buds on the twigs look a little funny, but I'm going to call that sassafras. But there's a little grove of sassafras in here. There's 1, 2, 3. There's a 4th or 5th one in here. There's a handful of them in here. to stop with this tree. This is tree 24. This is yellow birch. And this is really an unusual species to see here because yellow birch is more common up in the White Mountains, up in the Adirondacks, up in the Green Mountains. This is truly a northern New England species, and I probably talked about it already, I can't remember, but here in Maynard we're living within the tension zone of southern species and northern species. And so this northeast facing slope has a little pocket of yellow birch, and that I was really attracted to this. So curly bark like this, golden in color for a tree, and then you scratch the bark. Yeah, Brent, you should smell that. That's you could describe that. Oh, down further where I scratched the bark. Right. Ah. Huh. So it's more like a peppermint smell to me. And here's a faster growing, larger yellow birch. This was really a nice surprise to me because we're close to the ocean, we're low elevation, so I don't expect this species here, but we're on a northeast facing slope, so it's a little cooler and wetter here, and this is a good environment. And there's this yellow birch, there's one there, there's a larger one up there, up slope. And then there's a whole row of them right here along the stream. The stream drains the water treatment plant. The water always moves here, even when it's 15 below. There's a moving water and there's a patch of open water, and this is where the animals gather in the winter, the ducks, various waterfowl, and blue heron, great blue heron hang out here a lot. When I was walking here in the winter time, we scared them up. I felt bad. We scared them up every time. And Bettina Abbey, who's someone who helps maintain this trail, said this is where there's a lot of frogs, and this is where the great blue heron come to feast. Walk a little ways now. You can see the flatness and the width of this part of the trail, that it's an old road from a long time ago. You know, just enough for a wagon, I would guess. Another yellow birch right here. And this is young, slightly fast-growing sassafras bark. This weaving of the ridges and furrows. There's a slightly orange color in the bark a little bit, but that's the kind of bark that I think of when I think of sassafras. The first tree we showed you wasn't sassafras. It was sassafras. It wasn't the bark that I would teach normally. That's the bark that I would teach for sassafras. There's a group of them here. I see an alder. You see the with the buds on it? With the buds on it, but those aren't buds. Those are the cones from last year. So that's alder. Yeah. So we'll add another species. I don't know my species so well of alder, so we'll just call it alder for now. I'll look this up later. I could have looked it up before, but I don't know. That's 25 species now. I'll go down to this tree. We'll see it again. This is tree 26. This is black birch if you're from up north. If you're from down south, it's called sweet birch. And if you're from another time period, it's called cherry birch. But this is Petulolenta. This is a southern species, so we were just talking about this tension zone that we're living in. This is kind of a southern species, maybe not truly southern, but more southern than northern. It really likes moisture, so it's just above this wetland with the skunk cabbage. This is becoming one of my favorite trees. You can make a syrup out of its sap, like sugar maple, but it doesn't taste like sugar maple syrup, of course. But it's sap, and if you scratch the twigs, it smells more like wintergreen. I think a little more like wintergreen than peppermint. Peppermint is the yellow birch, and this is the really nice classic bark. It gets its name cherry birch because you can see these vertical or these horizontal stripes right here. These are lenticels like we saw on the cherry at the beginning of this hike, of today's hike. And so this is where the name cherry birch, I assume, comes from. And then down here, it breaks up and it gets blocky. We don't see it so much here, but it can, it has a form that I like to call tuxedo bark. It looks like a cummerbund, sort of. So I call it tuxedo bark sometimes, but that's black birch. It's got a blacker color bark for a birch. There's another one here. We'll get another one right on the trail. This is a species we've seen already. But if you can pan to the lower branches, Brent. This is black gum, black tupelo, pepper ridge. This is sylvatica, and that's a woodpecker.
Pileated.
Pileated. Which we will see evidence of them. I've seen them here. We'll see evidence up the trail. Not today, though. We're almost running out of time. But the branches are coming out of the stem at 90-degree angles. This is really one of the best ways to identify this species in this part of the world. There aren't many other species that do that. I think I see a witch hazel. I don't know my shrubs so well. I really want to call that a witch hazel right there. And that's the white-throated sparrow that just called Sam. Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. That was not a good one. There it is, right there. That's the white-throated sparrow. They live in the tops of the mountains of New England. In the summer, you go climb up 3,000, 4,000 feet, and that's all you hear. So it's a beautiful sign of high elevation summer in New England. Here's a black birch right here. Traveling down into this wetland, and the species composition has changed again. We have the oaks, but we have more of the black birch. There's a wonderful Nyssa sylvatica right here. You can see the 90-degree branching coming out of the stem. We have white ash right here, which is more of a wetland species. just want to stop on this tree. Oh, there's a white throat, right? Right there. This tree right here, Brent, you can see the branching again, 90-degree angle. That's Nyssa sylvatica. It's really one of the most difficult tree species to identify. There's nothing really characteristic about its leaves or its bark. Though when it gets 3 and 4 and 5 and 700 years old, its bark does look characteristic. But at this stage, there's nothing really stands out at. But the 90-degree branching really stands out. Here are 2 sassafras. And again, you've got the curvy stems and the curvy twigs. Is one of the best ways. And then last one. There's a really nice yellow birch bark, peely yellow, really wonderful. And my alarm actually went off about 2 minutes ago, but I just wanted to show you this one wetland. There's some trees up ahead I want to show you, but I think that'll be the next hike. They should be in flower by then. So I hope you enjoyed this. If mornings work pretty well, let us know. This will be archived on our YouTube page. I'll put the link down in the comments. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down in the comment section. I'll answer them today and tomorrow when I can, as soon as possible. And I'll keep a review of what we've done. 25 species in 3/4 of a mile. We're really lucky here in Maynard, though we might technically be in Acton now, to live in such a rich forest. So I hope you enjoyed this. Stay well. Hopefully we can gather in person soon. Bye.